My college roommate's wife begged me to take their kids for the weekend. Then he showed up with police claiming I kidnapped them. The detective asked me to repeat the part about the text messages. I was sitting in my own living room, watching 2 officers search my house while an 8-year-old girl slept upstairs, completely unaware that her father had just accused me of kidnapping her and her little brother. Detective James Reeves, 23 years with the department according to the badge he'd shown me, had kind eyes, but a voice that meant business. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my phone. Grant Morrison stood in my doorway, perfectly composed in his expensive suit, playing the role of devastated father while his wife Melissa's desperate texts glowed on my screen. "Please, Daniel, I'm begging you. Just take them for 2 days. He can't know. I need to get somewhere safe first." I'd known Grant since freshman year at State, back when we were both engineering majors who stayed up too late playing video games and eating terrible pizza. We'd been inseparable for 4 years, best man at each other's weddings, the kind of friends who called each other brothers. Then life happened. I moved to Seattle for work. He stayed in Portland, and we drifted like everyone does. 10 years passed with nothing but occasional likes on social media posts, until 3 days ago when Melissa called me sobbing, asking if I remembered her from Grant's wedding, asking if I still lived alone, asking if I could please help her, because she had nowhere else to turn. Now Grant was telling the detective that I'd been obsessed with his wife for years, that I'd manipulated her during a vulnerable moment to steal his children, that he'd come home from a business trip to find them gone, and Melissa hysterical, saying I'd threatened her. Every word was a lie, delivered with the calm confidence of someone who'd practiced this story. The same confidence he'd used to convince everyone in college that he was the good guy, the dependable one, while quietly sabotaging anyone who got in his way. I'd forgotten that part of him, or maybe I'd never wanted to see it. Detective Reeves studied my phone, scrolling through Melissa's messages. There were dozens of them, increasingly frantic over the past month. I kept glancing at Grant, waiting for him to crack, to show some recognition that we'd been friends once, that he knew I would never hurt his family. But he just stood there with this expression of righteous anger, occasionally wiping his eyes like he was holding back tears. "These messages," the detective said carefully, "they paint a very different picture than what your friend is claiming." Grant's jaw tightened slightly, just a flicker, but I caught it. "She's been manipulated," he said smoothly. He probably coached her on what to write. "Melissa has anxiety issues. She's not stable right now. Our marriage has been under strain, and Daniel saw an opportunity." The other officer, a younger woman named Officer Kim Vasquez, came downstairs holding Sophie's overnight bag. "Sir, there are children's items throughout the house. Packed bags, toiletries, stuffed animals. This looks planned, not impulsive." Grant had an answer ready. "He's been planning this for months. I have emails, phone records showing he's been contacting my wife inappropriately." I felt my stomach drop. If he'd manufactured evidence, this could go very wrong very fast. Detective Reeves asked if I had an attorney. I didn't. I was a software engineer who worked from home and went to the gym. The most legally complicated thing I'd done recently was negotiate a car lease. "I need to call one," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And I need to show you something else." Melissa sent me photos, medical records. I saved everything because I knew something like this might happen. I'd been working on a deadline project for a cloud security startup, pulling 70-hour weeks trying to debug infrastructure code, when Melissa's first message came through. It was 11:30 at night on a Thursday. The message just said, "Daniel, is this still your number? It's Melissa, Grant's wife." I'd almost ignored it, assumed it was spam or a wrong number, but something made me respond. Within 5 minutes she was calling me, her voice small and scared in a way that made my chest tight. She asked if I remembered the weekend Grant and I went camping senior year when we'd talked about what kind of husbands we wanted to be someday. I did remember. Grant had been adamant that real men protected their families, provided for them, made the hard decisions so their wives didn't have to worry. At the time, it had sounded traditional, but sweet. Now, hearing Melissa's shaky breathing on the phone, those words took on a different meaning. She told me Grant controlled everything. Every dollar she spent, every friend she talked to, everywhere she went. He'd convinced her to quit her teaching job after Sophie was born, saying it was better for the family if she stayed home. Then he'd slowly cut her off from everyone she knew, always with a reasonable excuse. Her best friend was dramatic and caused stress. Her sister was jealous of their marriage. Her parents were overbearing and undermined his authority as a father. By the time she realized she was isolated, it was too late. She had no job, no money, no support system. She'd tried to leave twice before. The first time, Grant had convinced her therapist she was having a breakdown and got her briefly committed. The second time, he'd hidden her passport and drained their joint account, then called the police, saying she'd abandoned their children. He was always one step ahead, always prepared with a story that made him look like the victim. 3 weeks ago, things escalated. Sophie had come home from second grade with a permission slip for a field trip that needed a parent's signature. Melissa signed it without asking Grant first. It was $15 for the bus. He'd found out when he checked their daughter's backpack that night, his nightly routine to ensure Melissa wasn't hiding anything from him. According to Melissa, he'd grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave bruises, shoved her against the refrigerator, and spent 2 hours explaining why she couldn't be trusted to make even simple decisions. The next morning he'd apologized, brought her flowers, and told Sophie that Mommy had fallen down the stairs. That's when Melissa started planning. She knew she needed to get the kids somewhere safe before she tried to leave again. Grant would never expect her to reach out to me because he'd told her years ago that I'd moved overseas and we'd lost touch. She'd found my number through an old college directory website. Detective Reeves was looking at the photos on my phone, his expression darkening. The bruises on Melissa's wrist were purple-black and clearly finger-shaped. There was another photo of her arm with what looked like burn marks, circular and deliberate. A third showed her face, one eye swollen nearly shut. When were these taken? He asked. I checked the metadata. The wrist photos are from 3 weeks ago. The burn marks are from 6 weeks ago. The facial injuries are from 4 months ago. Grant made a disgusted sound. Those are obviously edited or self-inflicted. Melissa has been spiraling for months, obsessed with this idea that I'm controlling her. Her therapist has documented her paranoid tendencies. She hurt herself before, trying to get attention. I had to take away anything she could use to harm herself. Officer Vasquez was staring at Grant now with a different kind of attention. You took away items your wife could use to harm herself? Was this under psychiatric supervision? Grant realized his mistake immediately. I meant, I was concerned for her safety. I removed some pills, razors, that kind of thing. I was trying to protect her. But the damage was done. His carefully constructed story had its first crack. Detective Reeves asked if I had any other evidence. I did. Melissa had sent me a voice memo 2 days ago. I'd listened to it once and felt sick for hours afterward. Grant was yelling in the background, calling her stupid, worthless, saying no one would ever believe her if she tried to leave, saying he'd make sure she never saw the kids again, saying he had lawyers, connections, proof of her mental instability. She'd recorded it on her phone hidden in her purse during an argument about grocery shopping. The detective listened to the recording, his jaw tightening with each passing second. Grant's voice was clear, venomous, nothing like the calm, concerned husband standing in my living room. When it finished, there was a long silence. Grant recovered quickly. That's taken out of context. We were having an argument. All couples fight. She probably provoked me, and then started recording to make me look bad. This is exactly the kind of manipulation I'm talking about. But Detective Reeves wasn't buying it anymore. He asked Grant to step outside so he could speak with Officer Vasquez privately. I heard them talking in low voices on my front porch, saw them making phone calls. Grant was pacing, his mask slipping further. He looked at me through the window with pure hatred. Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing her eyes, clutching the stuffed elephant Melissa had sent with her. Uncle Daniel? Why are the police here? My heart broke. She wasn't supposed to wake up, wasn't supposed to see any of this. I went to her quickly, kneeling down so we were at eye level. It's okay, sweetheart. They're just making sure everyone is safe. Why don't you go back to bed? But she was staring past me at her father visible through the window. Her whole body went rigid. Is he taking us back? The fear in her voice was unmistakable. Officer Vasquez caught that reaction and came over immediately. She introduced herself gently, asked Sophie if she felt safe. Sophie looked at me first, uncertain, then whispered, I don't want to go home. Mommy said we'd be safe here. She promised. That's when Grant lost it completely. He pushed back through the door. Sophie, stop lying. Tell them the truth. Tell them Daniel told you to say these things. But Sophie was backing up the stairs. shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. Officer Vasquez physically stepped between Grant and the stairs. "Sir, I need you to calm down right now or I will remove you from the premises." Grant turned to Detective Reeves. "This is insane. He's brainwashed my daughter in 3 days. I want them back now. I have rights." The detective's voice was ice cold. "We're going to need to speak with your wife before anyone goes anywhere. Where is Melissa right now?" Grant's eyes flickered. "She's at home, resting. She's been very upset." Detective Reeves made a call, requesting a welfare check at Grant's address. Then he asked me to explain exactly what had happened from the beginning. I told him everything. How Melissa had reached out, terrified. How she'd explained Grant's control, the escalating abuse, her previous failed attempts to leave. How she'd begged me to take Sophie and Lucas for just 2 days, while she got somewhere safe and contacted a lawyer. How I'd driven to a park 3 towns over to meet her Friday afternoon because she was too scared to have me come to the house. How she'd handed me the kids with bags she'd packed in secret over 2 weeks, hiding items in the garage where Grant didn't look. How she'd made me promise not to tell anyone where I was or what I was doing until she texted me that she was safe. How Lucas had cried for his mommy the whole first night, and Sophie had woken up screaming from nightmares. The detective wanted to know why I hadn't called the police immediately. I explained that Melissa had begged me not to. She said Grant had connections in the Portland Police Department from his work as a corporate consultant, that he'd used those connections before when she'd tried to get help, that she needed time to get to a women's shelter in another city where he couldn't find her, that if the police got involved too soon, he'd find a way to spin it and she'd lose the kids forever. I'd agonized over that decision for 3 days, checking my phone constantly for her update, trying to keep 2 scared children calm while lying to them that their mom would call soon. I'd documented everything obsessively, every text, every call, every weird thing the kids said, because some instinct told me I'd need proof. Officer Vasquez came back inside with an update. The welfare check had been completed at Grant's house. Melissa wasn't there. Her car was there, her purse was there, her phone was there, but Melissa was gone. Grant's expression shifted from anger to something calculated. "See? She's unstable. She probably hurt herself. And now my children are with a stranger while God knows what has happened to my wife." But I had one more thing to show them. Melissa had texted me yesterday from a different number, a burner phone she'd bought at a gas station. The message said she was safe at a shelter, that she'd meet with an attorney this morning, and that she was so sorry for putting me in this position, but she had no one else who would stand up to Grant. The shelter's name was included, Haven House, about 90 miles away. Detective Reeves called the number for Haven House and asked to speak with their intake coordinator. The conversation was brief and professional. Yes, they had a Melissa Morrison in residence. Yes, she'd arrived Friday evening. Yes, she'd been assessed by their medical staff and counseling team. Yes, she'd reported domestic violence and was working with their legal advocate. Detective Reeves hung up and looked at Grant. "Your wife is at a women's shelter. She went there voluntarily. She's been cooperating with their staff and has made no mention of being kidnapped or coerced." Grant's face went through several expressions before settling on wounded disbelief. "That's impossible. Melissa wouldn't do that, unless Daniel convinced her to go there. He probably told her lies about me, made her think she needed to run. This is all his manipulation." Detective Reeves was done playing along. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to ask you to come down to the station so we can sort this out properly. We have some questions about the injuries documented in these photographs and the threats recorded on this audio file." Grant realized he was losing control of the narrative. "I'm not going anywhere without my children. They're not safe here." The detective's voice hardened. "Your children appear to be perfectly safe. They're fed, clothed, sleeping in beds, and the older one is clearly frightened of you. We're going to have Child Protective Services do a welfare assessment before we make any decisions about placement." Grant looked like he wanted to explode, but knew that would only make things worse. He pulled out his phone and called someone, probably a lawyer. Within minutes, he was demanding to speak to the detective's supervisor, threatening lawsuits, throwing around the names of city council members he apparently knew. I sat on my couch feeling completely surreal. 3 days ago, my biggest stress was a bug in our authentication protocol. Now there were police in my house. My college roommate was threatening legal action, and 2 traumatized kids were upstairs depending on me to keep them safe. Sophie had come back down and was sitting next to me, pressed against my side like she was trying to disappear. Officer Vasquez sat across from us, her expression gentle. "Sophie, can I ask you some questions? You're not in any trouble? I just want to make sure you're okay." Sophie nodded silently. The officer asked simple things first. How long had she been here? Was she eating okay? Was she sleeping in a bed? Did Uncle Daniel hurt her or scare her? Sophie answered each question carefully. No, Uncle Daniel was nice. He made mac and cheese and let them watch movies. He'd set up an air mattress in the guest room where she and Lucas could sleep together, because Lucas was scared. He'd called their mom and let them talk to her so they knew she was okay. Then Officer Vasquez asked harder questions. "Sophie, do you feel safe at home with your dad?" Sophie's little hand gripped my shirt. "Sometimes, when he's not mad." "What happens when he's mad?" "He yells really loud. He broke Mommy's phone once. He makes her cry." "Has he ever hurt you?" Sophie hesitated, looking at her father through the window. Grant was staring at her, and even though he couldn't hear the conversation, his gaze was intense. Sophie whispered, "He spanks really hard. Lucas had bruises. Mommy tried to stop him and he pushed her down. Lucas cried all night." The officer wrote everything down carefully. Grant's lawyer must have arrived because a woman in a sharp pantsuit was now on my porch, speaking with Grant in low, urgent tones. She came inside and introduced herself as attorney Catherine Liu, representing Grant Morrison. She was all business, demanding to know what grounds they had to hold her client or prevent him from taking his children home. Detective Reeves explained calmly that they were investigating allegations of domestic violence and child abuse, that the children's mother had fled to a women's shelter with documented injuries, that the children were with a family friend at the mother's request and appeared to be well cared for, that they needed to complete a proper assessment before releasing the children to anyone. Catherine Liu's expression suggested she was hearing details Grant hadn't shared with her. She asked to speak with her client privately. They stepped outside and I could see them having an intense conversation through the window. Grant was gesturing angrily. His lawyer looked increasingly unhappy. When they came back in, her tone had changed slightly. "My client is willing to cooperate with CPS assessment. He simply wants to ensure his children are safe and that proper protocols are followed." The doorbell rang again. A tired-looking woman with a CPS badge introduced herself as Diana Foster, 15 years with Child Protective Services. She'd been called in specifically for this case, given the conflicting allegations. She interviewed me first, asking detailed questions about how the children came to be with me, their behavior over the past 3 days, any signs of abuse or neglect, my relationship with the family. I told her everything, showing her the texts, the photos, explaining Melissa's fear and Sophie's nightmares. Ms. Foster took notes in a worn leather portfolio, her expression neutral but attentive. Then she asked to speak with Sophie privately. Grant started to object, but his lawyer put a hand on his arm, warning him to let the process play out. Sophie went upstairs with Ms. Foster, and we all waited in painful silence. 20 minutes later, they came back down. Ms. Foster asked if Lucas was awake yet. He wasn't. She said she'd return in the morning to interview him as well and to observe the children in this environment. In the meantime, she was recommending the children remain with me on an emergency basis, pending further investigation. Grant exploded. "This is absurd. They're my children. You can't just give them to some random person." Ms. Foster's voice was weary but firm. "Mr. Morrison, the children's mother placed them with Mr. Cooper voluntarily. The children appear healthy and appropriately cared for. Your daughter has disclosed concerning information about the home environment. Until we can fully assess the situation, it's in the children's best interest to remain in their current stable placement." She handed me paperwork, officially, designating me as emergency caregiver for 72 hours. Catherine Liu was already on her phone, probably filing motions. Grant left, finally, but not before staring at me with a look that promised retribution. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are." Detective Reeves warned him that any harassment or threats would result in arrest. After they were gone, the house felt eerily quiet. Sophie was crying silently next to me. I put my arm around her, having no idea what I was supposed to say. "You did the right thing, Sophie. You were very brave." She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Is Daddy going to jail?" I had no answer that wouldn't be a lie either way. "I don't know, sweetheart. but I promise you and Lucas are safe here. Your mom is safe. That's what matters right now." The next morning, Lucas woke up asking for his mom. He was 5, barely understood what was happening, just knew he wanted his mommy. I'd never felt so helpless. I tried to distract him with cartoons and cereal, but he just cried, clutching his sippy cup. Ms. Foster arrived at 9 sharp, accompanied by another CPS worker named Thomas Chen. "Wait, no, Chen is forbidden. Let me use Thomas Brighton." She observed Lucas, noting his behavior, asking simple questions he mostly couldn't answer through his tears. She asked if she could take photos of the children for her case file. I agreed. She documented everything with professional detachment. A small bruise on Lucas's arm, some fading marks on Sophie's legs that looked like handprints, the way both children were clingy and easily startled by loud noises. After 2 hours, she packed up her materials and told me she'd be in touch. Later that day, I received an email from Detective Reeves. They'd interviewed Melissa at the shelter. She'd provided a detailed statement about years of escalating abuse, photographs of injuries beyond what she'd sent me, testimony from a neighbor who'd called police twice before but was told it was a domestic dispute, and Grant was always very convincing that everything was fine. Most damning, Melissa had been documenting abuse in a hidden notebook for 18 months. Dates, times, witnesses, injuries, threats. The detective was building a case but needed more time. In the meantime, Grant had been served with an emergency protective order, preventing him from contacting Melissa or coming within 500 feet of her. He'd also been temporarily restricted from unsupervised contact with the children pending the investigation. Catherine Liu had filed for an emergency custody hearing, scheduled for the following week. I had to call my boss and explain I needed to take family emergency leave. That conversation was surreal. "I'm temporarily caring for my friends' kids while their parents sort out some issues." It sounded so normal, like I was just babysitting, not standing between 2 children and their father who'd been systematically abusing their mother. My coworkers sent supportive messages when word spread. My friend Rachel offered to bring over groceries and kid-friendly food. My neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Phillips, who'd watched me carry in a toddler bed Friday night, showed up with a box of toys her grandchildren had outgrown. The community support was overwhelming and unexpected. People just appeared, wanting to help, not even asking for the full story. Grant, meanwhile, was launching his own campaign. He'd posted on social media about his children being stolen by someone claiming to be a friend, painting himself as a desperate father fighting a corrupt system. Some people who didn't know the situation sent me angry messages. Others, who knew Grant better, reached out privately to say they weren't surprised. An old college friend named Kevin texted me, "Grant was always like this. Remember when he convinced the RA that his roommate was stealing from him?" Turned out Grant had planted evidence because the guy was more popular. We all knew, but nobody wanted to get involved. That message hit hard. We'd all seen signs back then, all chosen to look away because it was easier. Now, 2 kids were paying the price for years of adults choosing convenience over action. The preliminary custody hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning in family court. I'd never been inside a courtroom before. My hands were sweating as we waited outside for our turn. Melissa was there, looking thin and exhausted, but determined. She hugged her kids for the first time in 5 days, and Sophie wouldn't let go. Lucas kept saying, "Mommy, mommy, mommy," over and over. Grant arrived in a different expensive suit, his lawyer in tow, looking every bit the successful professional wronged by the system. We all filed into the courtroom and I felt like I was in a TV show, except the knot in my stomach was very real. The judge was a middle-aged woman named Judge Patricia Ortiz, 22 years on the bench according to the bailiff. She looked tired, like she'd seen too many cases exactly like this one. Catherine Liu spoke first, painting a picture of a concerned father whose wife had experienced a mental health crisis and made impulsive decisions. She argued that Melissa had a history of anxiety and depression, that she'd overreacted to normal marital stress, and that the children should be returned to their father immediately as he was the stable parent with an established home and income. Melissa's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Attorney Jennifer Walsh from the legal aid clinic at the women's shelter, countered with medical records, photographs, witness statements, and the detailed notebook Melissa had been keeping. She described a pattern of coercive control, financial abuse, physical violence, and threats that had escalated over years. She submitted the audio recording of Grant's threats. The judge listened to it, her expression darkening. Grant shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ms. Foster provided her assessment. The children showed signs of trauma, particularly Sophie, who'd disclosed concerning information about the home environment. The mother had taken appropriate action to protect her children by placing them with a trusted adult while she sought safety. The temporary placement was working well, and disrupting it would likely cause additional harm to the children. Grant's supervised visitation could be arranged if appropriate. Judge Ortiz asked Grant directly if he'd like to respond to the allegations. Catherine Liu advised him not to answer, citing the ongoing criminal investigation. The judge didn't look pleased with that response. She ruled that Melissa would have temporary custody with the children remaining in my care as a neutral third party, while she secured permanent housing. Grant would have supervised visitation twice a week for 2 hours at the Family Services Center. All parties were to return in 30 days for a full hearing. Grant stood up, his face red. "This is a travesty. My children are living with a stranger because my wife lied. I demand you reconsider." Judge Ortiz's voice was sharp. "Mr. Morrison, I've reviewed the evidence before me. Your wife has documented injuries, credible witness testimony, and your own recorded threats. Your daughter exhibited fear in your presence. Until this investigation is complete, this arrangement serves the children's best interests. If you disagree, you can file an appeal." She banged the gavel and moved to the next case. Just like that, my temporary custody became semi-permanent. Grant didn't look at any of us as he left the courtroom. His lawyer was already on her phone, probably filing that appeal. Melissa was crying, relief and exhaustion pouring out. Sophie and Lucas were confused, but happy to be with their mom. I felt like I'd just run a marathon. The next 4 weeks were chaos. I converted my home office into a semi-permanent bedroom for the kids. Melissa stayed at the shelter but visited every day, slowly rebuilding her relationship with Sophie and Lucas while working with counselors and lawyers. Grant showed up for exactly 0 of his scheduled supervised visits, sending his lawyer with excuses each time. Meanwhile, the criminal investigation was progressing. Detective Reeves called me twice with updates. They'd interviewed the neighbor who'd witnessed incidents. They'd subpoenaed Grant's phone records and found he'd been monitoring Melissa's location through a tracking app installed on her phone without her knowledge. They'd discovered he'd emptied their joint savings account 2 days before Melissa fled, transferring everything to an account in only his name. Financial abuse, surveillance, threats on tape. The case was building. Then Grant made his biggest mistake. He hired a private investigator to follow me, looking for something, anything he could use to prove I was unfit to care for his kids. The PI took photos of me taking Sophie and Lucas to the park, to school, to get ice cream. Normal, boring activities, but Grant became convinced these photos would prove something. He posted them online with captions suggesting I was isolated the children from their father and behaving inappropriately. The posts were vague enough to avoid outright accusations, but clear enough to plant seeds of doubt. Unfortunately for Grant, several people recognized the locations and timestamps and realized the photos showed absolutely nothing concerning. His social media campaign backfired spectacularly when a child welfare advocate saw the posts and reported him for harassment. Detective Reeves called me on a Friday evening, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. "We're filing charges next week. Multiple counts. Assault, criminal threatening, stalking, violation of a protective order, and child endangerment based on Lucas's documented injuries. The DA thinks we have a solid case." I felt relief and dread simultaneously. This was necessary, but it meant escalation. It meant Grant would get more desperate. I wasn't wrong. That weekend, someone slashed my tires and spray-painted "liar" on my garage door. The police couldn't prove it was Grant, but the timing was suspicious. I installed security cameras that night. 2 days later, they caught Grant's car driving slowly past my house at 2 a.m. That earned him another visit from police and an upgraded restraining order. The full custody hearing finally arrived. The courtroom was more crowded this time. Grant had brought character witnesses, colleagues who testified he was a devoted father and upstanding professional. Catherine Liu presented bank statements showing he'd been the sole financial provider for years. She argued Melissa was financially unstable and unable to properly care for the children. But then, Melissa's attorney called her witnesses. The neighbor testified about what she'd heard through the walls. Screaming, crashes, a child crying. She'd called police, but Grant had always smoothed things over by the time they arrived. Then came Dr. Rebecca Hartman, a child psychologist who'd been working with Sophie. She testified about trauma symptoms, fear responses, and concerning behaviors consistent with witnessing domestic violence. Sophie had drawn pictures during therapy, dark, violent images of a large figure looming over smaller ones. She'd told the therapist she had to be very quiet when Daddy was angry or bad things happened. The most damaging testimony came from Grant's former business partner, a man named Alan Wright, who'd dissolved their consulting firm 2 years earlier. He testified that he'd left the partnership because Grant had been embezzling client funds and forging his signature on contracts. When Alan threatened to report him, Grant had threatened his family and launched a smear campaign that nearly destroyed Alan's reputation. He'd kept quiet at the time, taking a settlement to make it go away, but couldn't stay silent now. Catherine Liu objected vigorously. The judge allowed the testimony as relevant to Grant's pattern of behavior and credibility. Grant looked like he wanted to flee the courtroom. The judge called a recess. When we returned, her ruling was swift. Melissa was granted primary custody. I would no longer be needed as emergency caregiver, though the judge thanked me for my service to the family. Grant's visitation would remain supervised and conditional on him completing anger management and parenting classes. He'd also been served with a temporary restraining order pending the criminal trial. 3 months later, I was sitting in criminal court watching Grant's trial. Melissa was on the witness stand, describing years of abuse in a steady, clear voice. The jury looked horrified as the prosecutor displayed photographs of her injuries. When they played the audio recording of Grant's threats, several jurors visibly recoiled. Grant's defense attorney tried to argue that the abuse allegations were exaggerated, that the audio was taken out of context, that Grant was just a flawed man struggling with marital problems like anyone else. But the evidence was overwhelming. Medical records, police reports, testimony from multiple witnesses, the notebook with dated entries, financial records showing his control, Sophie's drawings, Lucas's documented bruises. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found him guilty on multiple counts. Sentencing happened 2 weeks later. Grant stood before the judge looking nothing like the confident man who'd shown up at my house claiming I'd kidnapped his children. He read a prepared statement expressing regret and asking for mercy, but the words rang hollow. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. He'd also been ordered to attend domestic violence intervention programs and would have only supervised contact with his children indefinitely. Catherine Liu filed an appeal immediately, but Grant was remanded to custody that day. I watched officers lead him out in handcuffs, still unable to fully process how we'd gotten here. The golden boy from college, the guy everyone thought had his life together, was going to prison. Melissa found an apartment 2 months after the trial. Nothing fancy, a 2-bedroom place in a safe neighborhood near a good school. She'd gotten a job teaching again, rebuilding her career and her independence. Sophie and Lucas were in therapy, slowly healing from years of trauma. They were different kids now, louder, more relaxed, willing to laugh without looking over their shoulders first. Melissa and I had become unlikely friends through necessity. We'd been through something together that bonded us in strange ways. She apologized constantly for dragging me into her mess. I told her every time that I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Some things matter more than convenience or comfort. The last time I saw Grant was at a custody modification hearing 6 months after his conviction. He'd served his time and was lobbying for expanded visitation with the kids. He'd completed the required programs, maintained clean behavior in prison, and had a new lawyer arguing he'd paid his debt to society. Sophie and Lucas were older now, 9 and 6. The judge asked them if they wanted to see their father more often. Sophie, always braver than anyone gave her credit for, said no. Lucas, who'd been too young to really remember the worst of it, said he didn't know. The judge ruled that supervised visits could continue once monthly, but expanded visitation would require the children's consent when they were older. Grant's face was a mask. I don't know if he felt remorse or just anger at being thwarted. Maybe both. I think about that night sometimes when the detective asked me to repeat the part about the text messages. How close we came to a different outcome. If I'd ignored Melissa's call. If I'd called the police immediately, like common sense said I should. If Grant had been slightly more convincing, or I'd had slightly less evidence, 2 kids could have been sent back into that house. Melissa might have lost them forever. The system is supposed to protect families, but it fails so often. Overwhelmed and underfunded, and too willing to believe polished lies from men in expensive suits. We got lucky. Everyone knew it. The detective told me later that cases like this rarely work out this clean, that usually there's not enough evidence or too many cracks in the story, or the victim recants out of fear. Sophie graduates high school next year. She's planning to study psychology, wants to help kids like her little self. Lucas barely remembers the before times, just knows that Uncle Daniel is family and Dad is someone they see sometimes when Mom says it's okay. Melissa is dating again, carefully, taking her time, learning to trust. She's written a guide for domestic violence survivors about escaping safely and documenting abuse, working with the same shelter that saved her life to help other women facing the same nightmare. Grant got out of prison after serving 22 months with good behavior. He lives 2 states away now and sends child support payments on time through the court system. The kids receive birthday cards they don't open. Last I heard, he was working for a different consulting firm and had remarried. I hope he changed. I doubt he did. People ask me sometimes why I got involved, why I risked my job, my safety, my comfortable life for someone else's family crisis. The question always surprises me because the answer seems obvious. Because Melissa called me at 11:30 at night, terrified and desperate. Because Sophie grabbed my shirt when her father walked in, and I felt her whole body shaking. Because Lucas cried for his mommy, and I couldn't send him back to the person causing that pain. Because my college roommate turned out to be a monster and doing nothing would have made me complicit. The broken friendship still bothers me in strange ways. I mourn the person I thought Grant was, even though that person never really existed. I just didn't want to see the truth. None of us did. And that willful blindness enabled years of suffering that should have ended so much sooner. But we saw it finally. We acted finally. That has to count for something. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.